Joshua and Judges PowerPoint Notes Part 2. So where we left off in the last PowerPoint was we were showing that God told the Israelites to put the ban on the Canaanites, wipe them all out. And we were discussing this idea that ban shows that the Israelites trust in God alone during the war. They weren't seeking anything else. They weren't doing this for glory or for power or for riches. Because if you wipe all those riches out, it's kind of hard to say that you were after that because you destroyed it. So if you destroy all the things in the city, then it's a sign that you're doing it only for God and not for yourself. To understand the violence in the book of Joshua, remember, the words are conditioned by the language and the culture of the Israelites. They are ex-slaves who are now having to war to get what they were promised. They have to war to get into the promised land. And so when they talk about God and his power, they're going to see him reflected in themselves. So for them, they're going to see God as a powerful warrior who doesn't let any enemy stand in his way. And so when they describe God, when they write about God, they're conditioned by their own experiences, a condition of hardship, of war, of struggle. And so they're going to see God and write about God as a powerful warrior. Very important. So Joshua and Moses, we know Joshua took Moses' role when Moses died. What are their similarities? What are their parallels? Well, the first thing that's similar, they both crossed bodies of water. If you want to play with Google Earth and see where the city of Jericho is, you can see that it's protected by the Jordan River, which the Israelites had to cross. So Moses had his Red Sea crossing. Joshua crosses the Jordan River, parallel in that way. There's Moses crossing the Red Sea, and there's Joshua carrying the Ark of the Covenant across the Jordan River. And they both were obedient to God, here put as Yahweh. Whatever God tells Moses to do, he does it. Same with Joshua. Whatever God tells Joshua to do, Joshua does it. They're very faithful to God. And they both get divine support. Remember, Moses didn't do all those things on his own, all those miracles and those plagues on his own. He did it because he had the support of God. Same thing with Joshua. Joshua gets the divine support he needs to conquer the Holy Land, to get into the Promised Land, conquer the city of Jericho. He does that all with divine support. So Joshua as a role model, he's got true commitment to the covenant. He's faithful to the 10 Commandments. He doesn't stray too far from it. He doesn't go to the left or right. He's an example of someone who's faithful to the 10 Commandments, to the Sinai covenant, and that results in blessings from God. In the 24th chapter, the 15th verse, it talks about Joshua's undying devotion to God. This guy is super faithful, super loyal to the covenant, and by extension, to God. And remember, we talked about in the first PowerPoint that the beginning of the book of Joshua and the end of the book of Joshua have epic speeches in them, right? Any good war story needs an epic speech to start it off and to finish it off. And so you can see here in the 24th chapter of Joshua, which is the last chapter of Joshua, he's got this epic line. He defeats the enemy, and he's talking to his troops, and he goes, all right now we can see that God saved us. He saved us from the Egyptians. He's brought us up to this land. He's conquered our enemies. He's bringing us victory. And so you Israelites have to decide right now who you're going to serve. Are you going to serve the polytheistic gods of the Canaanites? Are you going to stray from God? Or are you going to follow God? And he goes, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, which is a line that just reinforces the fact that Joshua is going to serve God. He's not going to be tempted to fall away now that he's been provided victory. And here's a little map you can see on the left of the screen is Egypt, and that purple line. This is straight out of your Bibles, the hard copies that we have in the classroom. You can see the purple line where they're starting in Egypt, and Moses leads them into the wilderness down at the bottom middle of your screen in that C quadrant. It's not a quadrant, but it's a little square. You can see Mount Sinai. This is where God gets the 10 Commandments. So they start heading north because up north is where the Promised Land is. So they wander. Oops. Go back here. I was trying to be fancy. So they wander up north, and you can see in the top right of the screen they get the Dead Sea, and they got to go around that. And that little squiggly line at the very top that feeds into the Dead Sea, just north of the Dead Sea, that's the Jordan River, and that's where the purple arrow ends, and that's where Joshua and his troops have to cross to get into the Promised Land. It's also where Moses dies, as you can see at the top there on the right. And so we talked about the second part of Joshua being the division of the land. Keep in mind, Joshua as a book is really easily structured. Starts epic speech, war, division of the land, epic speech, and the book's over. So here's another picture from your hard copy Bibles where you can see the division of the land. And if those names look familiar to you, well, congratulations, because those are the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. Those were the names of the 12 sons of Israel. Keep in mind, those actual sons have been dead for a long time because they're ancient history at this point, but their tribes remain. So even though those 12 sons are long dead, their tribes remain. So you see Benjamin and Ephraim and Dan and Manasseh and all these guys. They are the tribes that remain from the 12 sons of Israel. And so that's how they divided up the land. You can read about it in the second part of the book of Joshua. Then that brings us to the Judges. So Judges can be seen here as we started off in the presentation. And they come just about 100 years after, about 200 years after Joshua, in this era between 1200 and 1000 BC. And it fills in the transition period between the conquest of the land and the beginning of the United Monarchy. Well, what does this mean? When Joshua conquers the land, there's still kind of a ragtag group of people. You can see in the previous slide that it was 12 tribes. They weren't super unified. About 200 years later, they're going to realize that they want a king. But in between the time when Joshua conquers and 200 years later when they finally get a king, this 200-year period is called the Age of the Judges. So we have here a cycle of sin redemption. And it's what the Israelites are going to keep falling into over and over and over. So once the Israelites get into the promised land, you guys know the Israelites, they're pretty quickly going to fall away from God because that's how they do. They're people and they're flawed. So they start worshiping the gods of the Canaanites, which kind of makes sense because now they're surrounded by Canaanites. They're in a new land, so they're tempted to do what the people around them are doing. So they start to fall away from God and start worshiping other gods. And when that happens, well, then they get punished, right? And punished for a warrior means you're defeated by your enemies. So people are going to start invading and they're going to conquer the Israelites. Because the worst thing for an Israelite at this time is to be conquered by their enemies. And so if God's punishing them, he's going to make them lose to their enemies. And of course, when they start losing, they go, "Oh, God, please help us. We're so sorry." Like people do when they lose. They go to God and they go, "Please help us. So we're so sorry. We repent and we will promise to follow you always." And of course, God, being God, sends people to help them. He doesn't forget about them. So he sends a judge. And that's what we talk about when we say judges in this unit. Not people with long black robes. That's something else. But these judges are there to save the people, to guide them back to God. These are going to be epic warriors. Think of judges as the superheroes of the Bible. People in the Bible with superpower, like strength given by God, to deliver the Israelites from their enemies. And it goes over and over and over again because this cycle goes round and round. So the book of Judges, which comes right after Joshua, talks about this period before they get a king, before the United Monarchy. And it's a short account of 12 heroic yet flawed human leaders called judges. So there were 12 judges. And again, think of judges as the superheroes of the Bible. Very powerful leaders who guided the Israelites. And there's 12 of them. And they're not perfect. Like everybody we meet in the Bible, they've got their flaws. And so these are 12 stories of 12 heroes. Judges are heroes. So the first thing a judge could do, these 12 judges, if you will read their stories, they almost read like comic book stories, really. They're stories about heroes. One of the things these heroes do is they settle tribal disputes, because when you got 12 different tribes, they don't always see eye to eye. So these heroes step in and help settle disputes. They led military defenses against invaders, because when you're in the promised land, people want to get in. And so these superhero judges would lead attacks and defenses against foreign invaders so the Israelites could stay in the promised land. There were men and women, so we've got a female judge. It's not all men. They were raised up by the Spirit of the Lord. They were charismatic. That means they could speak to the people. They had power from God. They had exceptional power to do God's will. If you read about some of these judges, especially a guy like Samson, we're going to look at, he's got some astonishing power, really rivaling a superhero's power. in this epic story, just to illustrate how powerful God is and how much he protects his people when he sends the judges, the heroes. And not only do they do good, but they challenge the people to do good themselves. So when they're out there kicking butt, when the superheroes, judges are kicking butt, they're also telling the people to remain faithful to God. They don't just do good. They tell the people, follow the 10 Commandments. Don't forget about God. So they kind of practice what they preach. Now, why were the Israelites tempted in the when they got into the Promised Land? Well, because remember, Canaanites lived in the Promised Land, and they worshipped other gods besides Yahweh. They were called Baals, Baals. They were Canaanite gods of earth and fertility, which took on many forms. Now, if you're in a new land, let's just go back 1 second real quick, because I want to talk about these two foreign gods. Whoop, whoop. See, I make the same mistakes I make in class. Here we go. Okay. So think about being an Israelite in a new land, and you're growing some food. I did it again. Well, you can just listen to the beautiful sound of my voice. If you're trying to grow food in the Promised Land, and the crops aren't going so great, you might be tempted to worship the god of fertility, or the god of the earth, to kind of get your crops to grow. Obviously, this is a big no-no. The second god is the Asherah, the Canaanite goddess of fertility. Here's a sculpture you can see. Very fertile. Think about what's important for these people, these Israelites. It's important for them to have food and to have kids. So if they are like Sarah back in the day, or like all those women who couldn't have kids, and they're trying to have kids, they might be tempted to pray to a goddess of fertility. If your Canaanite neighbor is saying, hey, I see you have some problem having kids, if you put this fertile statue in your house, I guarantee you're going to have kids. That's a pretty tempting thing to do, right? To put a little idol in your house and hopefully it gets you kids. But again, this is a no-no, obviously, because God, in the first set of the 3 commandments, says, I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods besides me. So these worshiping of other gods to bring fortune into the Israelites' life is something that the judges warn against. So again, to wrap up, the judges are the conscience for the Israelites. They tell them what to do. They call the Israelites to be faithful to the Sinai covenant, to the 10 commandments. And if they are faithful, they will receive success in battle, military success. So if the Israelites follow God at this time, they will receive military victory. And if they're disobedient, they will be punished with military defeat. Because remember, there's nothing worse for an Israelite at this time than to lose in battle. So if you follow the 10 commandments, you'll be successful. If you don't, you'll be defeated. All right. Good job, guys. I'll see you next time.